Gopal Krishna Gokhale was born on 9th May 1866 and died on 19th February 1915. Thus, we have met today to celebrate Gokhale's 149th birthday. As our name itself suggests, we belong to the liberal lineage of Mahadev Govind Ranade, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and V.S. Srinivasa Shastri. Srinivasa Shastri, in fact, actively provided guidance in shaping our activities in the early days. Other personages who evinced consistent interest in our pursuits included Sir M. Vishweshwaraya, Sri C. Rajagopalachari, and others. M.S. Subbulakshmi and T. Sadashivam were our lifelong supporters. There is hardly need to explain why our founder Dr. D.V. Gundappa named this institution after Gokhale. Having been inspired by Dadabhai Nauroji and others, D.V. Gundappa regarded public work as a tapasya, undergirded by conscientious study and objectivity, impartiality, and a constructive approach. These qualities were amply displayed by Gokhale in his work in various capacities, such as Member of Imperial Council, Chairman of Pune Municipality, evidence before various royal commissions, and so on. It is well known that Gandhi considered Gokhale as his political guru. The portrait of Gokhale you are seeing before you here, it was unveiled by Mahatma Gandhi at the condolence meeting organized by D.V. Gundappa and Associates at Bangalore on 8th May 1915, soon after Gokhale's demise. The liberal legacy of Gopal Krishna Gokhale is worth cherishing in these days marked by physical and intellectual pollution. Gokhale was respected equally by Indians and the British because of his integrity, objectivity, and graciousness. Gokhale played no small part in guiding and shaping Gandhi's approach to public life. Despite some fundamental differences, as for instance in regard to separate electorates, their mutual respect remained unshaken. About Gokhale's self-effacing nature, recalling one instance should suffice. Gokhale was principal of the Ferguson College, Pune. After his disciple Dr. R.P. Paranjape completed advanced studies in England, becoming a senior wrangler, and returned to India, Gokhale voluntarily stepped down, handing over the principalship to his junior Dr. Paranjape. It is such an exemplar that we are remembering today. Today's Gokhale Day lecture is being delivered by Professor B. Ramesh Babu, an erudite scholar and academician. Based in Hyderabad, Professor Ramesh Babu is Executive Director of Center for Global Studies. She also heads the Center for Governance and Development, Hyderabad. He was earlier a visiting professor at the Political Science Department of the University of Hyderabad. Earlier, he was professor and head Department of Civics and Politics, Bombay University, for nearly a decade and a half. He was also a visiting professor with Texas University, USA, where he taught American foreign policy and India's foreign policy. In all, his teaching and research experience has extended over 4.5 decades. He has guided over a dozen PhDs and he has been on the editorial board of prestigious journals. International politics and American studies have been one of his specializations. He has authored some 8 books, including 3 on globalization, and numerous research articles. He has contributed studied articles to mainstream newspapers also. He has made presentations in several seminars in India and abroad. He is a polyglot and is fluent in French and Spanish, besides Sanskrit, Hindi, and Telugu. The subject he has chosen for today's Gokhale Day lecture is Friends Not Allies, an analysis of India-America relations today. As all know, international relations keep changing and are not static. The great theoretician Kautilya too had observed 2300 years ago, Narajno vidyate mitram, Raja mitram nakasya vai. The king has no permanent friends. Likewise, no king can remain someone's friend for all time. Changing situations cast their shadow on international relationships. Nehru's pro-Soviet stance was a factor during early years of our independence. In later years, the Bangla Liberation War had an impact. During Nixon-Kissinger years, Indo-US relations were downhill. The Pokhran implosion was another turning point. There seemed to be some normalization in the globalization years. In the foreseeable future, perhaps the increasing Chinese aggression may become a major factor for reckoning in Indo-US relations. There is thus hardly need to say how critically important and relevant the topic is. I am sure we shall all benefit from Professor Ramesh Babu's insights and experience. Many distinguished friends are here with us. I particularly welcome Justice K.S. Puttaswamy, who is with us luckily today. I request Professor Ramesh Babu to deliver the address. You can speak sitting if you like.
Friends, Justice Puttaswamy, and distinguished persons assembled here, it's a great honor for me to be here, especially when the institution is named after Gokhale. I'm also a member of the Indian Liberal Group today, which is also one of the important intellectual trends which is not the mainstream in Indian politics today, unfortunately. But what is important is many of the ideas of the liberal group are taken over by others, and therefore the wind is taken away from the sails of the liberal thinking. More important for me, personally, it's a homecoming for me, because as a school-going child, I used to come to Bangalore quite often. My maternal grandfather is from Bangalore, and my mother is from Bangalore. Therefore, I have learned enough to say Nana Kannada Barodilla, just as a self-defense. And today, my memories have come back, because morning after taking bath, I went to Basavanagudi, where I used to play as a small child. Shankar Mutt and Basavanagudi were our childhood place of reckoning. In fact, I used to jump from Mr. M.R. Arya's compound wall and go to Shankarmat instead of going via the road as a small boy. So for me, this coming back to Bangalore, especially big thanks for the Gokhale Institute and friends here, it has been a great personal experience for me. Yes. I hope you can hear me in the back, because I never ask whether it is clear or not, because even after you hear, it may not be clear. Because often ambiguity is part of diplomatic relations. But as a teacher, I always insist that we should clearly understand ambiguity. Ambiguity does not mean our understanding is unclear. Our understanding of ambiguity should be clear. And those of us who live in joint families understand this very well, because there is nothing black and white, and so many things are right and wrong at the same time. I also have one preliminary comment to make before I proceed with my lecture. I often ask my students in the class, how is it the speaker is standing and everybody else is sitting? The reason for that is he is the only one who can stand the lecture. All others have to sit out and bear it. So it is important for me as a teacher that I do not indulge in elaborate explanation, because most of the people in the audience, especially the older ones, all know about United States as much as probably I do. But it's my job to know about United States. It's my area of specialization. United States is my second home. I went there in 1957, some 55 years ago, 56 years ago, as a PhD scholar to Princeton University. Since then, I have been studying American politics as part of my professional career. From 1948 elections to the 2008 elections, I have studied every election of the United States and published. For me, unless you know the domestic politics of a country, you will not understand the foreign policy of the country. Often today you have scholars who work only on the foreign policy, and they do not understand the implications of the foreign policy, because foreign policy is only an instrument for achieving domestic objectives. Foreign policy is not more important than domestic policy. Foreign policy is one more instrument to achieve domestic objectives. The lecture title today obviously leads me, I should talk briefly about the past and more elaborately about the present and a little bit about future. Unless you understand the past, we cannot really understand the present. And briefly, as our learned speaker before me mentioned, we have gone through many ups and downs in Indo-US relations. And also my topic is India-US relations and not US-India relations. I want to make that distinction because I am studying from India's perspective, India's relation with the United States, not US-India relations from the American perspective, because that will be quite different. I can have another lecture on that, but that's a different lecture, and this is a different lecture. In the earlier period, as has been observed rightly, we had a lot of ups and downs, and mostly downs in the Cold War period in terms of India-US relations. It is only from 1980s that the upswing has become more stable. The reason for that is we have moved, not United States. We have moved rightward politically, ideologically, economically, and strategically in the years from 1980s to the present. United States remained where it is, always right-wing, because business is the business of United States. Capitalism is America's holy cow. Socialism has been our holy cow in the past. And today, nobody talks about socialist pattern of society in our public life, because socialism has been more or less banned from public lectures. All politicians today are more business-like than their rivals. In the past, there used to be more socialists than their rivals. That itself shows the climate that has already completed and changed. And also, I have talked about friends and not allies. United States, India are today friends. And as the previous speaker mentioned, there is nothing permanent about it. But it has to endure in order to be strike roots. India and United States are friends, not allies. Pakistan and United States are allies, not friends. I want this to be understood in terms of the comparison, because there is a difference between friendship and allies. You can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your relatives. And of course, you know, relatives is a relative expression. There are distant relatives, close relatives, and relatives whom you would like, they were not your relatives, and so on, right? So it is very important that we understand that. So in the past, almost up to 1970s, as a student of American foreign policy, I realized most American leaders, in their view, India was the largest of the unimportant countries. When we say that, a lot of Indian people get hurt emotionally. But in terms of America's global priorities, up to 1970s or so, India was not an important player for them, because they had their anti-communism, anti-Soviet Union stance, and all over the world they have built military alliance systems for their purpose, and Pakistan was their friend and not us. So it is very important to understand from their perspective, India was the largest of the unimportant countries till 1980s or so. Today, of course, the situation has changed completely. India is the third largest economy in the world, and American economy being in a downturn stage, they have to sell things to all over the world, including to India, on a large scale. One of the things which America wants to sell always are weapons. And India today is the biggest weapons purchaser in the whole world, higher than China. At one time, if some of you who are older remember, we used to condemn United States as merchant of death. They are selling weapons to everybody, and they live on selling weapons to other people. Today, we are the biggest sought-after country because they want to sell weapons to India. India is anxiously and enthusiastically buying them left and right without planning properly. That's the second part of the problem. After this, some 2 or 3 preliminary remarks I have to make to set the India-US relations in a proper context. Both the countries are very vociferous democracies. Everybody says whatever they want to feel, whatever they feel like in public all the time, whether they like it or not. And with the result, we have many times problems where some right-wing politician or a left-wing politician in India will make a huge remark condemning the United States. And similarly, somebody from there will also respond. And this becomes a public issue. So rhetoric is part of the spoilers in India-US relations. Because when politicians get onto the stage and go on to rhetoric, it's very difficult to restrain their logic. There is no logic most of the time. So with the result, we will find some nut here says something, and some nut there replies. So we have nuts on both sides. And this is very important for us to remember. Second, I want from the audience, those of you who do not have a close relative in the United States, raise your hand. Right? It's very important. It's actually, I am surprised that so many people from Bangalore with IT Web and Hub do not have close relatives in the United States. It's unusual. And often, if you don't have, people always say, no, we have some cousin who is already there. That is, to have some close personal relationship with somebody in the United States is one of the desirable things in the minds of most Indians of upper class and middle class. This is very important. According to me, every Bangalorean is an aspirational citizen of United States. This is very important because we want to condemn, criticize loudly, but at the same time, we want to go there all the time for personal gain. And the number of Indians that are in the United States today is quite large, especially after the 1965 Immigration Act. Quality immigrants have gone to the United States, which is different from immigrants of Indian origin in Gulf or United Kingdom. In fact, I remember in the 1970s in Punjab, when you go to the passport office and apply for a visa in the United States, they were asked, why are you going to the United States? The Sardarji would say, for higher education. Then say, please sign here. No, I will put ungli chap. So he is going for higher education in the United Kingdom. Whereas all the people that have gone to the United States from 1965 onwards are quality immigrants. And every other day we feel very proud and happy. Some Indian origin person has been given a new honor in the United States. There is a vicarious satisfaction that you are making good in the white man's world. Don't forget that. If a white man pats you on the back, there is some elation about your being an achiever. So we still don't have that sense of equanimity or equality in dealing with the United States. This psychological factor is very important. And especially for my generation, it is much more important than the present generation. New people are more comfortable and equanimous about it than my generation or generation even older than to me. Generation older to me always wanted to go to England. And my generation and next generation, everybody wants to go to United States. So the people-to-people contact between the two countries is one of the most unique features of India's relations with the United States. This is a complicating factor because it's not a government-to-government relationship. It is also people-to-people relationship. As a result, there are always very high mutual expectations. Indians and Americans expect a great deal from each other. When you expect a great deal from one another, and which is unrealistic, you will have disappointment and frustration. In the early part of India's relation with the United States, in my writings I have explained, from 1947 to about, say, 1960s, unfulfillment of mutual expectations was the basis for hostility between the two countries. Unfulfillment of mutual expectations. It's very important because if expectations are realistic, then you don't have that problem. Even today, expectations from both sides are so high that they are always likely to be falling short of the expectations. With the result, even if the relations are very good, we always have a nasty feeling that somehow something more is required, which is very unrealistic. Because relations between India and United States today are the best possible ever in human history in between two democracies. But people don't feel that. They think something more is required. I have many friends in the United States who have similar problems in terms of they expect from India. India is a democracy, rule of law, this, that, and so on. Why are you not on our side? In fact, President Bush made it famous. In his re-election bid, he asked the people in the State Department, India is a democracy, isn't it? They have rule of law, isn't it? They have elections, isn't it? Why are they not on our side? And then he started very assiduously to make sure India is on America's side. That is when the situation had changed, and already India had started LPG, not the gas, but liberalization, privatization, and globalization, whereby we have moved rightward in our economic political ideology very dramatically. Since we have become a right-wing economic ideological nation, the United States had every reason to be on our side. But very often still we think we are a socialist country. So there is a gap between the reality. And as an observer of both the countries, I have many times said that United States is more socialist than it wants to admit in public, and India is more socialist than it can afford. This is the reality. This is the problem. United States has social security, universal health coverage, unemployment compensation, accident compensation, health, and everything. But they don't want to admit it in public because their holy cow is to be right-wing capitalist business. Whereas in India, we claim we are socialist, but our poor remain as poor as before. So we are rhetorically socialist, and in reality not socialist enough. So this is again part of the problem between the two countries. As a result, what were estranged democracies in the past today have become engaged democracies. Estranged democracies have become engaged democracies. We are always engaged with the United States at all levels, not only from government to government, but also from private sector to private sector, public sector units to public sector, and individuals, NGOs, groups, and all that. Almost there is no activity in India which does not have a link with the United States. Even all the stamp collectors in India have link with the United States. This is very important because all the activities that we are involved, we are always comparing with what is happening in the United States. What is latest, whether it is fashion or trash, it is same. It should be like United States. And this is not from today. United States has always exercised what I have called in my writings imperialism of attraction. European powers had political imperialism, colonialism, and economic imperialism. United States always exercised imperialism of attraction. Even our concept of happiness has been now influenced by American concept of happiness. If I talk to my father or my grandfather, if you ask him what is happiness, he would look at the welfare of his children, prosperity and progress of his grandchildren as part of his happiness. Now that's not American concept of happiness. American concept of happiness is to consume more and more and more. Consumption is happiness. So American Constitution, as all of you know, guarantees life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness, not its attainment. As a result, when Americans are pursuing happiness, it has become not only their right, but it is their duty to pursue happiness. Any red-blooded American must pursue happiness, otherwise he is unfit in that society. So therefore, you have to find happiness in the pursuit. Pursuit of happiness has become happiness in the pursuit, because you will never attain it. Because the whole concept of marketization of consumption is, you are never happy. If you are happy, then consumption will stop. Then American business will stop. Right? So therefore, you have to go on asking for more, whether you need it or not, which is different from traditional society's concept of happiness, which is based on contentment. Don't rock the boat. Don't make things unnecessarily risky. Our concept of happiness has been different. I am not saying which is good, which is bad. That's a different issue. But this has impact on what you do and what you don't do. Now, going into the details of the India-US relations, the rightward shift, which I have mentioned, you will be surprised, started from Indira Gandhi. A lot of people think of Indira Gandhi as the archpriest of socialism. But after the emergency was over, when she came back to power, she realized unless she delivered goods, nobody will keep her in power. Therefore, from her time, the rightward shift in our economic planning started very small, in a small way. And it was called delicensing, decontrol, and deregulation. I don't know how many of you remember that. And the foundation for that was laid in a meeting between Indira Gandhi and Ronald Reagan. And they both decided that there should be change in India-US relations, and this should be brought from the top. What they decided is, commenting negatively about each other by government spokesmen should stop. And this I have said in my writing, mutual carping must end. Mutual carping must end. And reciprocal restraint should start. That is, whatever you want to say, find positive things to say. And if you have negative things to say, be silent. And what is interesting is, both in their meeting decided this, and they gave orders down the line that this should be the practice from hereafter. I know this from first hand. Because subsequently, and also at that time, it so happened that I was in the United States third or fourth, fifth time as part of my study. And Rajiv Gandhi was in the entourage along with Mrs. Gandhi's state visit. And Rajiv Gandhi addressed the press club in Cosmos in Washington. I was a professor in George Washington University at that time. I attended that meeting. Rajiv Gandhi said, in so many words, in India we have decided to move rightward. If you people come with a lot of investment, our rightward shift will be further strengthened. This is exactly what he said. A lot of people don't know. And it's very important to realize that. Subsequently, I had occasion to meet Harry Barnes, who was Carter's ambassador to India. He visited ASRC, American Studies Research Center, where I was one of the founder members and also an academic associate. I asked him, sir, as ambassadors, we are great in saying a long number of words when there is nothing much to be said. That's the diplomat job. And it's a classic example. When a diplomat says yes, it means maybe. When a diplomat says maybe, it means no. If a diplomat says no, he is no diplomat. So Harry Barnes, I asked him, sir, how is it you are able to say positive things in Indo-US relations when things are so bad? Said, our president has now told us how to keep quiet. Right? So it's very important to understand these nuances when you go into these politics of the places. And when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister subsequently, if you remember, the delicensing, decontrol, and deregulation went further, and he introduced what was called one window clearance. I don't know how many of you remember that. All clearances will be given from one window. And I happened to go to that office subsequently, and the actual implementers told me, sir, he says so many things, but all the 64 signatures will be given from this window. Right? So we are a great nation which fails in implementing. We come up with a lot of good policies, a good diagnosis, but we don't have the political will, determination, and steadfastness to implement those good ideas into practice. So Rajiv Gandhi's one window policy was a kind of a joke among business circles because it was never implemented in reality. It is only when P.V. Narasimha Rao came to power, I don't know how many of you know enough about him. I regard him as Apara Chanakya of Indian politics. Because he is the only one who kept a 5-year minority government in office. You can understand how difficult it is in Indian politics. And at the same time, keep Gandhi family out. You keep Gandhi family out from interfering and stay in power for 5 years, nobody can achieve that. Only P.V. Narasimha Rao was able to do it. And it's very important. At that time, he would come and meet Sonia Gandhi once in a while to make sure she doesn't go do any mischief. And then slowly he would reduce his visits and keep her out. And he is the one who publicly declared, which was later privately said, publicly later declared, Nehru's nonsense of socialism must stop. If India has to become an economically powerful country, growth has to be achieved, Nehru legacy has to be abandoned. It requires enormous courage to say that in India. And Manmohan Singh was his finance minister. And you know, rest of it is history. And again, this proves to me, Manmohan Singh can be a number 2 man. He can never be number 1 man. That's the difference between Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh. Because economic policies are to be politically sheltered. Economic policies may be good, inherently merit-worthy, but they have to be sheltered by able hands from the socialist rhetoric and left-wing preoccupation which is part of the fashion in this country. And in fact, I have suffered myself many times because of this in Delhi. If you are not a left-wing man, you are not an intellectual. That was the fashion in Delhi in my days when I was a PhD student and subsequently a teacher. Only left-wing people can be intellectuals. A right-wing person cannot be an intellectual. So that was the fashion in Delhi. Some of it still hangs on. Even today, there are a lot of presumptuous people on the left wing who are hollow and who think they are great intellectuals. But what is important is whether your intellectual label is good or not, I don't care. But one aside I must mention to you, during the days of emergency, I was already in Bombay University. There was a meeting held in Shanmugananda Hall in Bombay called Intellectuals for Indira. This was headed by a Chinese specialist professor by V.P. Dutt from JNU. I know him very well. Next day, Lakshman had a great cartoon. He said, I saw you in Shanmugananda Hall. I didn't know you were an intellectual. How can intellectuals be for Indira? I can't understand that. No intellectual worth his salt can be in favor of Indira Gandhi during the emergency. Right? But that has to be understood. I know this personally because after the emergency was withdrawn and elections were held, I became very active in politics. I became the chairman of the 14 Parties Federation and works for the defeat of Congress party in my Lok Sabha constituency, who was Haribhau Gokhale, the law minister. I was a neighbor of him. Before the election started, I met him. Sir, I am working for your defeat because you are the one who moved the emergency bill in the parliament. And I became a respected Bombay University professor, a big symbol. And we defeated Haribhau Gokhale by a margin of 2.5 lakhs. That's very important. It's not my achievement. What is important is those 3-4 months, the whole climate in the country had changed. When myself and my wife started campaigning, everybody thought this professor is nuts. One day he will be eliminated by some police or somebody because police were following me. CID was following me to see what was happening with me. But in those 3 months, the whole climate in the country had changed. I am just one of the individuals, thousands and thousands of people in this country who worked for that shift in the opinion. And that's very important to realize. Now, after Narasimha Rao, the liberal capitalist reforms have become national policy because the NDA government that came also continued the same thing. And UPA government that came subsequently also has continued. But today, we are not so sure whether that LPG had really brought a lot of gas in our economy or not. Because a lot of inadequacies of the problem and progress are showing up. Because all the promises made for inclusive growth did not prove to be achieved. When Indira Gandhi started Garibi Hatao, it became Garib Ko Hatao. Now, Manmohan Singh's politics of inclusive growth has not really included. While the number of people who are below poverty line has gone up, because of our population growth, number of people who are poor has increased. So therefore, the politics of inclusive growth, just like part of our sloganeering in the past, has become a rhetoric rather than a reality. Now, of course, I am digressing into Indian politics, but that's part of my weakness or preoccupation. In the long history of India-US relations, the India-US civilian nuclear deal is the greatest achievement. Though the subsequent aftermath after the deal was passed has not yielded results as expected for other reasons, the deal itself is a very important milestone in our foreign policy. I will leave this journal later here for others. I held a national seminar on this India-US nuclear deal and published a special issue of the journal, of which I am the editor. And I have studied that in great depth. I happened to be in the United States at that time, and I followed the second term of Bush and all the activities that are going on in relation to the nuclear deal. I don't know how many of you are interested in the details of it, but it started with the NDA period and it went on with the UPA. So it was a national policy and it was not a partisan policy. In fact, BJP would have been very happy if it happened under their watch. Because they lost the power, it happened in the other side. During the whole period of these negotiations, which went on for many years, both democracies played an important part. That is, there would be criticism in the American side about America giving too many concessions, and there would be discussion in India that we are yielding too much to the United States. So when two countries fight on that lines, it means something is right. You must understand that in diplomacy, because nobody can get what all they want. You always get the deal is the best possible deal at that time. And that is what is important. What is important is, for the first time, India has been able to come out of the nuclear isolation. We were able to be part of the nuclear suppliers group and nuclear civilian group of people who will produce. That was the achievement. If some of you have questions, I will be happy to answer. But what is important is, after that started what was called the strategic partnership between India and the United States. And what is important is, today, India-US relations are so extensive, so intensive, that there is hardly any activity from HIV aid, Ayurveda to atomic energy, which is not part of the Indo-US relationship. When John Kerry came last time, a year ago, they were reviewing 46 dialogues that were going on between the two countries. 46 dialogues at the summit level, which has never happened with any other country. Only other country where I could think of as a part of international relations specialist, similar problem is there with Brazil and United States. Brazil and United States also have similar type of mutual expectations, large country and so on. I'm studying Brazil's policies, so I have some understanding of that. So India today has become not the largest of the unimportant countries, but largest of the important countries. This was achieved because of our economic growth, not our political rhetoric, because India is a big, large economy. And from the US perspective, if they want to get out of their economic slowdown, they have to sell goods to all the countries all over the world. And India is one of the big markets. And as I told you, weapons are the ones which Americans always want to sell, because if you sell one big aircraft, you don't have to sell a lot of chocolates. You don't need Robin's ice cream, right? If you sell two aircraft carriers or big bombers, then that takes care of so many things. Only problem I have is the failure of our defense minister and the bureaucracy in this weapons relationship. We have become a passive purchaser of weapons. Whereas the strategic partnership agreement was that weapons will be produced jointly, dual-use technology will be given to India, and we will become co-producers. That has not happened. And America is very happy. They want to dump all they have, and India is buying. So we have to get out of this relationship. But I must end finally by saying the Bush era proximity between the two countries has now reached a plateau. President Obama is not like President Bush. President Bush was a simple man. For him, either you are right or wrong, you are enemy or friend. For Obama, there are a lot of nuances in this. And as a senator, Obama never supported India-US nuclear deal. And he was happy or unhappy, but he inherited a policy and he went along with it. And I don't know if any of you know or not, in the first year of his administration, Obama went first to China. And when he went to China, he offered to China that let us jointly become the managers of the rest of the world. And very funnily, China said, we don't want to fall into your trap. But China's view is, America wanted to second China into their global hegemony as a junior partner, right? Nobody can be a senior partner with the United States. You must understand that very clearly. People say China is growing and all that. If United States is in the 14th floor, China is in the basement in terms of size, scale of the economy, scale of technology, scale of the size. Last year, United States spent $700 billion on their defense budget. And China's budget is $132 billion. So don't have any illusions that China is a match to the United States. There is no match. Only problem is the will to exercise that power in the United States has become less. Because of their failures in Iran, failure in Iraq, failure in Afghanistan, and the past experience of Vietnam, American people do not want more adventures in foreign policy area by United States. So Obama has to respect that. And intellectual also is in favor of not throwing his weight around all over the world. So Obama today is not such a great friend of India as Bush was. But we should not have any illusions on that score, because as our president has said, nobody is permanent friends, right? So we cannot expect that level of friendship to go on. But what is important is the level of relationship between the two countries, as I mentioned earlier, is so vast, so intense, so extensive, that there will be ups and downs. And we have reached a very high plateau. To expect that this will jump into a great thing is unrealistic. I remember Soviet Union used to publish statistics during Stalin days. They say our car production has gone up by 2,000 times, which means they were producing 2 cars earlier, they became 4,000. But that's not the case about the United States. United States is a multi-trillion economy. Therefore, 2% growth in the United States is like a big ocean. So we have to understand that. In this equation, which is very important for India, is to realize China is our most dangerous enemy. If you want to cope with China, you must keep United States on our side. whether we like it or not. If you want to make compromises, you make this and that, but United States should be on our side, because that's the only thing China fears in terms of its dealing with India. Therefore, United States, India, and Japan should now become a strategic partnership to keep China from expanding in its aggressive manner. And Japan will be a very willing partner, because Japan has been victim recently of Chinese aggressive expansion on an island called Senkaku, which is in Japanese possession today. China is reviving all the old, hitherto inherited historical disputes and activating them. And China claims anything that was with China in their long history of Chinese empire must come back to China. So I have talked to many Chinese scholars and told them, in that case, you should give Greater Kailash to us and surrender Manas Sarovar and also Tashkent, because we have cultural connection. If you are saying Arunachal is southern Tibet, then we have also other claims to make. It is most preposterous for any country to claim anything that was under them any time in the past should come back to them. There will be only wars. And only yesterday, this item. Chinese ship has attacked Vietnamese ship by water cannon, so that Vietnamese will not go to the island which is in their control. And last week, they did the same thing to Philippines. And Philippines had complained to the International Court of Justice, and nothing will happen, because China will not care about International Court of Justice. Therefore, I have advocated in my recent writings, what India should do is to keep China deterred from aggression. And we cannot do it ourselves. We must build a coalition of concerned countries, which include Japan, Australia, and Philippines, Vietnam, all the Asian countries, and they will be willing to come to this coalition. And China should get this message. Next time when you do something on the Himalayas, we will support everybody who has dispute with you. China has disputes with 20 countries all around the world in terms of their territorial land disputes, including Russia. So it is very important our policy in the future make sure United States is on our side, whether Obama is in power or not, whether whenever next president comes or next prime minister comes here, proximity with the United States has to be the foundation of India's foreign policy towards United States. Thank you for patiently listening to you. I will be happy to respond to questions. Thank you. I'm sorry, I can't help it. It's a huge topic.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Your lecture was really good. You have covered. As our Secretary Ramaswamy sir said, after independence, if you would have not followed pro-Soviet policies, you could have gone to pro-American policy, our country's position should have been better today than what would have been this. That you also covered. After 80s, definitely it has improved, but still we are not up to this one. If some of the policies, like recent policies, like Kalam was searched, so many things, United States has not shown restraint, I feel. That's one thing. Next is China's, you told, the strategic, this one between India, the Japanese, and this one. They have got dispute with everybody. Now what I feel is, how we should go ahead. Means in the ahead, what should be the policy? Because as you told, all our IT. In Bangalore, I have got some 10 relatives in US. Like that, everybody has got in their home. I say, anybody you see, they are in US. But now, our people are following our culture there in US. Yes. So, now how we can improve that relations, and what all things you can suggest for improvement of those relations? That's what one thing first.
Very good.
Okay. And your lecture was very good. You have covered all strategic business,
Thank
you know
you.
very well.
Thank you. I hope my lecture was comprehensive and not exhausting, because that's very important. It is not a question of whether you are pro-America or not. Even after 47, when our independence came, it was just not natural to expect that we will be pro-America. Because you remember, we fought and became independent from the colonial West. Emotionally, it is not possible for a country which fought independence against a Western colonialism to be part of the American or Western group. So non-alignment was a logical process at that time historically. But what is important is, I don't know how many of you remember Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, greatest, wisest politicians of India. He suggested at that time, Nehru's socialist, he had used an interesting word, infatuation is not good for the country. What was needed is to produce more, become dependent, and have productivity on a large scale and not go into inflation. As Professor Ramaswamy we were discussing, one of our problems is we print so much money and there are not enough goods. So productivity should be the basis rather than inflation. So at that time, Rajagopalachari and the Swatantra Party people have advocated a policy which we are following today. Of course, with some variations. But what is important is we lost in that process more than 20 years, 25 years. So it is not this pro-America. You see, unless there is growth, we cannot distribute. Earlier, our rhetoric was we were distributing poverty. Now we want to distribute riches. That is the difference.
That American economy is still good today, but NASA fund cutting, then Americans slowdown of the economy and is what we see in the papers. China is heading in the economic front to US and all. But what you told is 1% growth of China is
Yes.
America is more than 10%
Right.
growth of
No, but you see, we must understand the scale. They are on two different scales. Of course, China has achieved a great deal. I admire China's achievement. But you must understand that what Chinese sell all over the world are goods made in China's prisons, China's forced labor, and they don't pay wages to their labor. And they talk about socialism, but they are the most exploitative capitalist system they have. Market socialism is only a euphemism for market, and there is no socialism. In fact, China is sitting today on an explosive keg of enormous discontent all over rural China. In fact, there are many small towns in China where they are not allowing Beijing government agents to come into their land and saying, you keep out, we will manage our own affairs. But we should not exaggerate and have the hope there will be big rebellion against China. That's not what I am saying. But China's growth today has to be reversed. I don't know how many of you know, there is so much pollution in China. Every morning China declares when people can go out, when people cannot go out. I know this personally because my elder brother's son works in China, in Beijing. He is a big executive in Shell International Company, and he is a globally transferable job. And today he is in China. And his driver tells him, sir, today morning we cannot go anywhere. We can only go after 11 o'clock. So if you are achieving so much growth, at what price? And people are rebelling against that. So, but I am not the one who wants to have hope in others' discomfort. That is not the policy. We want China also to be happy. That's not the point. But our economic planning was bad because unless you produce wealth, how will you share it? So we cannot share wealth before it is created. For creating wealth, you need investment. you need capital. Only accumulated capital will produce next time. Therefore, government should stop being in business and doing its main responsibility of providing for the welfare of the people properly. Instead of that, we are in the business also. Most of the public sector undertakings, if you know today, many of them are doing well, many of them are not doing well. In fact, in the beginning, they were called PSUs, public sector undertakings. The very phrase is non-entrepreneurial. What do you mean an undertaking? You undertake for losses? Only undertakers do that. But what you have today, we call them PSEs, public sector enterprises. So they have changed their, that is, public sector enterprises also must make profit, then invest. They should not be white elephants of the nation. So this basic theory of Rajagopalachari, that you live within your means, produce more, then go on to the next step of increasing your means, live in your means, is such a conservative, old-fashioned thing that people don't want to follow it. But that is the reality. Because you chase after rainbows and mirages, nothing will happen. And that is one of our problems. So it is very important that we follow the model of producing wealth. This does not mean we have to become corporate capitalists, nor it means crony capitalism. They are different. My only problem is, unless you invest, you will not have growth. And investment has to come from savings and surplus. You create more surplus, then you distribute it. Instead of that, we distribute first what you don't have. How can you distribute? So that is how you have all kinds of corruption and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Respected sir, I think throughout your lecture you were speaking about economic growth, etc., and also relations between America and India in this direction. I want to know, sir, actually when we fought for our independence, our leaders at that time, so though we were fighting for our independence, all their fight was from a moral perspective. So I call it as political morality. So how do we define political morality of various nations like United States, India, etc.? Somehow we are still, because when we hear very interesting lectures in Gokhale Institute, when they talk about the past, I felt we always stood for morality and Satyame Vijayate, those concepts. But who is ensuring that political morality in the nations today? Because we thought United Nations will do that, but it is not doing anything. And these are the things which are concerns a common man. Because because there is a lot of everywhere competition is there, there is no cooperation in our friendship. I think how these things can be brought about in future. Is there any hope for the man? That's all I wanted to say.
This is a very important question. And it is very good to talk about this in Gokhale Institute, because we don't have leaders like Gokhale anymore. In fact, in my writings, I have discussed what we have today are not leaders, but they are followers of their following. That is all Vakkalega leader is Vakkalega followers. Right? Kamma leader is Kamma followers. So what you have is, according to me, a leader is somebody who will take the people who will not go there otherwise. That is what is a leader. What we have leader is litmus papers. The political opinion of their following is what determines who is the leader. And therefore, internal rivalry among, say, Kammas and Reddys in Andhra Pradesh has become such. One Reddy leader will promise the sky, other Reddy leader would promise sky and also heaven. How will you achieve that? And so the lowest common denominator of your following's narrowest aspirations become the electoral success. So we don't have leaders. Last of the genuine leaders we had was Lal Bahadur Shastri. Since then, we have leaders and no leaders. And today we have only frauds and not leaders. or we have dummies like Manmohan Singh. Right? So, what is a leader? Leader is somebody who has the willpower to take the people to new areas where their selfishness will not allow them to go. And I agree with this gentleman who talked about political morality. In fact, it may look cynical, but I am more hopeful and optimistic than him. Because even today, if you talk to common people, they will say, this is adharma, this is anyaya. As long as our common people say such things, there is hope. Because that vocabulary is gone. But today still it is there. I have seen in so many villages, something happens, they know they cannot do anything about it, but they say it is anyaya hai, ye adharma hai. This leader is a fraud. We don't trust him. But as long as that is there is hope. And also there is another important source of hope, which comes from a different side of political morality. This is young professionals in India. They want performance. And if they don't perform, you throw out. They are not asking moral questions like you and me. They are saying it's the business of the government to deliver goods. No corruption, transparency and accountability. And while young people are not as moralistic as we want them, their immoral professionalism also has hope for us in this country. Of course, I am not only gathering straws of hope, but what else will you do? I used to think some 20 years ago, our politics has gone into patal. But after patal, there are some more things now. We are going adha patal. And coming from Andhra Pradesh, if I look at Jagan as a leader in my state, Rajshekar Reddy's son, how much more corrupt can you get? But still he is likely to win many seats. So as long as we have politics of that kind, this problem will remain. As a political scientist, I have defined elections in India as advanced auction of stolen goods. Advanced auction of stolen goods. Right? You bid for this, I will bid for more, and whoever bids for highest, and this is happening. In some villages, I have known, people are coming, when politicians come, they say, you give 5 lakhs to our village, then we will vote for your party. Otherwise, you go out. Because you have not done anything for our village. It may sound nice, but they are also indulging in corruption at a popular level. So there is not that much lack of hope as people think.
Thank you, sir. During the Cold War era, there was a tussle between the two worlds. And after all is these episodes, and yet still China maintains some wavelength with the US. But this episode with Ukraine, does that mean US is having some anti-communistic hysteria still now?
IT companies?
No. Does that mean China, India, US is having some anti-communistic hysteria still now? No.
Communism is dead in the United States long ago. But what is funny is, I don't know how many of you know, even today people think of only Democratic Party and Republican Party. But every year, there are at least 14, 15 parties in election fray in the United States. One of them is the Communist Party of the United States. They don't get any votes. Even the particular candidate that stands gets half a vote in terms of the constituency. But the party is still there. There are very funny parties in the United States. There is a Vegetarian Party of the United States. There is a Prohibition Party of the United States. And there is a party which calls it National Association for Majority Rights. So we are not the only country which has nuts. There are a lot of people who want to contest their name in the presidential race because that is one of their history. I know one case of in India where is one fellow who is always contesting for president for last every election. There are some people like that. But that adds flavor to the election process. And we must admire their guts and courage and are not afraid of being laughed off the stage. They have people like that in the United States. Yes. Yes, Anuradha, please.
I just wanted to know. No, I get it.
Yeah. I'm happy Anuradha, Dr. Anuradha Ramanna is one of our colleagues, and I was like her teacher, not her teacher actually, like her teacher.
I like the speech the talk that you gave, sir. But the question I wanted to ask you is, in all this China, US, and other countries emerging as big powers, where do you see Russia in it? Because it looks like as if it's trying to take over the mantle of the former Soviet Union once again and try to emerge as a second superpower to United States. So where do you see here? And then do we see a shift towards Russia any time by the political leadership of India?
Very good, very, very good point. Our relations with Russia is another example which confirms our Ramaswamy sir's position. They are not permanent friends. When Soviet Union collapsed, demised and communism collapsed, we were the first country we drifted away from Russia, forgetting all the years of their solid support for us. We were quite ungrateful for a short period. And that period is over. And we are coming back to Russia in many ways. In fact, many of the previous agreements with Russia in defense and naval aircraft carrier and atomic energy are coming back. And all this credit goes to Putin. Russia is safe, but a confident, aggressive leadership makes a difference. That is what is important for us to realize. The same country is led by Nehru, same country is led by Lal Bahadur Shastri, same country is led by Deve Gowda, right? Same country is led by all kinds of leaders, but there is a difference. Today we have a non-functioning leader, Manmohan Singh. As a result, what has happened? So the resources, infrastructure of a country will be same, but the dynamic leadership provides the catalytic difference. And Putin has made it very clear to United States, no nonsense. In my territory, in my area, I will not allow you to poach. Whether it is right or wrong is a different issue. And Putin's Russia is coming back in a big way. And what is important is, in the association called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, we are part of an international gathering which is in favor of non-hegemonic international relations. Therefore, that is an important new area where Indian foreign policy is very much involved. BRICS has announced, as you know, to come up with an alternative international currency for dollar. Whether we'll succeed or not is different, but once you have an alternative currency to dollar, the whole international politics will change. If you remember, India-Russia trade was rupee-ruble trade. A lot of people don't even realize how important it is, because we were paying to Russia in rupees and not hard foreign exchange. That is why we were buying from Russia weapons and other things which are of an inferior quality in terms of international competition, but they were available for us in rupees. So in international politics, you not only buy what is best, but what is available in favorable terms. So Russia is coming back in a big way, And since I am talking of India-US relations, I did not talk about Russia. But Russia is an important balancer in the future. There is a pentagon of 5 powers in the future that will decide global strategic architecture. United States, China, India, Japan, Russia, in that order. European Union will come if they are united. But European Union is much disunited than a union. Therefore, while they are the biggest economy, they may not. But this pentagon of powers will decide the future strategic architecture of global politics.
ನಾಳೆ ಸಂಜೆ 6 ಗಂಟೆಗೆ ಹಿಂದೂಸ್ತಾನಿ ಶಾಸ್ತ್ರೀಯ ಭಕ್ತಿ ಸಂಗೀತ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ರವೀಂದ್ರ ಕಾಟೋಟಿ ಮತ್ತು ತಂಡದಿಂದ ನಾಳೆ ಸಂಜೆ 6 ಗಂಟೆಗೆ. You will all agree that we have listened to a most interesting, comprehensive and articulate presentation about an intricate topic. Professor Ramesh Babu started providing a backdrop to the subject by observing how we have moved to the right, but US has remained where it was, and so on. And then he made a most important point that we have to overcome this obsessive, unfounded admiration for the US and so on. Likewise, many Americans too have over expectations from India and so on. These psychological factors too have to be reckoned. And then we have yet to outgrow the mindset that we are a socialist country. He made a most important point. And also he said that in reality US is in practice more socialistic than us. But we are still stuck with poverty and so on. Now giving a historical overview, he told us how it was really P.V. Narasimha Rao who effectively stopped the progress of socialism. Economic policies have to be politically sheltered, as he said. And after P.V. Narasimha Rao, capitalist reform became our national policy. And it continued even during the NDA period. And then the eventual fallout from this, which he described. See, when recently, a year ago, John Kerry came here, there was dialogue on as many as 46 issues. That itself indicates India's enhanced status in America's eyes. So we have to view international relations in this background. And then coming to China, in real terms, as he said, China is no match for the USA as far as scale is concerned. So India should therefore try to remain on the right side of the US. India should liaise with countries like Japan, Philippines and so on to contain China. India cannot do it on its own. These are the realities. On the whole, Professor Ramesh Babu has given a very articulate and clear picture of not only the past and present but in the immediate future. On behalf of Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs and all of you, I extend to him our respectful thanks for his excellent presentation. I request Justice K.S. Puttaswamy to come on to the stage and honor the lecturer.
We are a secular socialist republic. And as Puttaswamy sir knows, Indian Liberal Group, we have filed a petition in the Supreme Court that this word socialist should be dropped from the preamble because we are no more a socialist country. And what is funny is the Supreme Court has refused to hear this because it's not an urgent matter.